2026, one of the most controversial subjects in modern history returned to the center of public attention. For decades, it had been known by different names: flying saucers, UFOs, unidentified aerial phenomena, and now, in official government language, UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena. But this time, the story did not begin with a leaked video, an anonymous witness, or a rumor from a remote military base. It began with an official release. On February 19, 2026, President Donald J. Trump signed a directive ordering the Department of War and every relevant federal agency to identify, review, declassify, and release files connected to UFOs, UAP, alien life, extraterrestrial life, and related historical records. The system created to carry out that order was called PURSUE, the Presidential Unsealing and Reporting System for UAP Encounters. The release was hosted at war.gov/UFO, with the Department of War working alongside the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and other government agencies. The first release appeared on May 8, 2026. 162 files went live simultaneously, 120 PDF documents, 28 videos, and 14 photographs. 82 came from the Pentagon, 56 from the FBI, 12 from NASA, 8 from the State Department. The second followed on May 22nd. 7 agencies were officially named in the PURSUE program. The Department of Energy submitted no files in the first release. Its records followed in the second tranche on May 22nd, including surveillance imagery from a nuclear weapons facility and scientific correspondence connected to Los Alamos. Together, they opened the first stage of a much larger archive: military videos, witness reports, intelligence-related material, NASA records, FBI files, and older Cold War-era UFO cases. Some of the files were modern. Some were historical. Some involved aircraft sensors, infrared cameras, and military platforms. One military infrared video from 2023 shows an object performing maneuvers that no conventional aircraft should be able to survive. Some involved NASA astronaut reports, nuclear facilities, federal witnesses, old FBI memos, and strange objects reported near sensitive locations. That is what makes the 2026 release different. It is not built around one dramatic video, one witness account, or one final revelation. It is built around the record that accumulated over decades: reports from different agencies, footage captured by military sensor systems, statements from witnesses, NASA transcripts, FBI memos, and documents that stayed inside official channels until they were brought together for public release. What they contained was something the government had spent decades filing away and never explaining. And now, for the first time, it was public. The screen is black. Then something appears. It is small. It is moving. And the most advanced targeting system the United States Air Force has ever put on a combat platform cannot tell you what it is. This is not a blurry photograph from 1967. This is not a grainy home video shot through a car window. This is military infrared sensor footage, the same technology used to guide missiles onto targets, the same optics used to track enemy aircraft at night across hundreds of miles. And in May 2026, the U.S. government released it to the public for the first time. Not a summary, not a transcript, the actual footage with official file numbers and timestamps attached. Before anything else, you need to understand what you are actually looking at. These videos were not shot with a conventional camera. They were captured by infrared sensors, systems that detect heat, not visible light. What appears on screen in every one of these clips is officially described as an area of contrast. That phrase means something appeared in the sensor image that stood out from its background. Something that moved, held position, or changed in a way the sensor registered as distinct. It does not mean alien craft. It does not mean drone or balloon either. It means the sensor saw something it could distinguish from everything around it. And that was as far as the identification went. That is the honest starting point for everything that follows. Now watch what happens when the military actually tries to track one. Jordan-Syria border. A USMQ-9 Reaper drone is operating in the Central Command area of responsibility. Its infrared sensor locks onto an unidentified object, the same kind of lock the platform uses to track weapons targets. For the first 20 seconds, the sensor holds it. The object stays centered in the frame. Then tracking breaks. The sensor loses the target. In the same instant, the object exits the right side of the frame. Not slowly, not gradually. There one moment, gone the next. Faster than a weapons-grade targeting system could follow. The file is designated DOW-UAP-PR051. Its title is Syrian UAP Instant Acceleration. The official description is careful. It notes the object rapidly exits the frame at the moment the sensor stops tracking it, meaning the apparent speed may be tied to the sensor behavior, not necessarily the object's own movement. The strongest independent analysis argues this reflects a tracking failure rather than a confirmed physical maneuver. That may be right, but consider what that explanation still requires. A military platform using weapons-grade optics locked onto something it could not identify, and then could not keep. The footage was originally recorded in 2021. It was not uploaded to a classified network until 2024. What happened in those 3 years is not documented in the public record. What happened over Syria that day remains unresolved. Over Iran in August 2022, the situation shifted from 1 target to 5. DOW UAPPR050 shows 4 areas of contrast entering the sensor frame from the lower left, crossing together, and exiting near the lower center. A 5th appears separately from the upper left. The official description calls it a formation over water. Not one, stray thermal signature. Multiple distinct contacts moving across the same infrared frame in a coordinated pattern over a maritime area with no public identification of what they were, where they came from, or whether their movement was intentional. The official description doesn't call them aircraft. It calls them areas of contrast. Given what the footage shows, that may be the most honest thing it could say. Water became one of the defining settings of the entire video collection. Several files carry the label USO, Unidentified Submerged Object, DOW-UAP-PR 052, titled UAP-USO Formation, and recorded on June 1st, 2024, shows a group of 4 infrared targets moving across the frame before the footage cuts, zooms, and degrades through multiple processing filters. The title suggests objects entering the water. The footage doesn't clearly show that, but it does show multiple targets in a maritime infrared file that official analysts could not identify. DOW PPR 067 goes further. Multiple. Spherical U. PUSO near sub. March 25th, 2022, in and out of water. A submarine is in the frame. Multiple targets move around it repeatedly from multiple directions. Independent analysts have noted the motion is consistent with birds at low altitude, and that is a serious possibility worth acknowledging. But the footage also confirms that something moved around a U.S. military submarine, and no one in the official record identified what it was. Some of the other videos complicate things differently. DOW PR 056 Spherical U, pulsing over water, shows an object that appears to change brightness rhythmically. But the official description notes the sensor itself switched contrast modes during the clip. The pulse may be the camera, not the object. DOW TR 057A over the Yellow Sea. In January 2023, shows a target that appears, fades into clouds, and reappears when the sensor zooms in. A related Afghanistan clip from November 2020 follows the same pattern, with digital enhancement added after the fact that makes the object appear sharper than the original footage supports. In each of these cases, the sensor was doing something. The question is, how much of what you see is the object, and how much is the camera? That question matters, because the answer changes everything. Then there is Greece. January 2024. A U.S. military aircraft operating under Central Command. 1 minute and 5 seconds of footage captured across multiple sensor modes simultaneously. DOW-UAP-PR028 is the most technically documented case in the entire video collection. The accompanying mission report describes the object as diamond-shaped, with a non-maneuvering appendage at the bottom, moving at approximately 434 knots, roughly 800 kilometers per hour. The observer added one detail that separates this case from almost everything else in the release. The object was only detectable through the shortwave infrared sensor, not difficult to see in other modes, not partially visible, completely invisible to every other sensor on the platform, and fully visible to one. The footage shows exactly that. The screen opens split between electro-optical and SWIR feeds. On the SWIR side, an inverted teardrop shape with a vertical trailing mass appears near the center. The display shifts to full-screen SWIR. The object holds position. At 56 seconds, the operator switches to visible spectrum. The target disappears entirely. When the operator switches back to SWIR, it doesn't reappear. This is not a question of image quality. Something was moving at 434 knots that military sensors could detect in one specific wavelength, and not another. Something with a shape precise enough that the pilot described it in writing. Something that was gone before the sensor could recover it. The Greece case doesn't prove what the object was. What it documents, in official military records, reviewed and released by the U.S. government, is that something was there, and that current military technology could only partially account for it. Across the full collection, the same word keeps appearing in the official record. Not confirmed extraterrestrial, not identified as balloon or drone, not explained, unresolved, chain of custody gaps, digital alterations, titles that describe more than the footage confirms, objects that AARO, the Pentagon's own UAP investigative office, whose entire job is to be skeptical, reviewed in full and still could not identify. The U.S. military recorded something, put it through its most specialized analytical office, declassified it, published it for the entire world to see, and still could not tell you what it was. That is where the 2026 release begins. 7 federal agents, 2 nights, 1 location the government will not name. What they saw has never been explained. The file was released on May 8, 2026, as part of the first Pursue tranche. 4 pages of briefing slides. 7 U.S. federal law enforcement special agents, identified only as USPER-1 through USPER-7, operating in 3 separate 2-person teams across different positions. The agency is redacted. The location is redacted. What is not redacted is what they reported. AARO, the Pentagon's own UAP investigative office, reviewed everything, traveled to the site, conducted follow-up measurements, then put its conclusion in writing. Among the most compelling within AARO's current holdings. That assessment did not come from a UFO enthusiast. It came from the office whose entire job is to be skeptical. It started at dusk. 6 agents, spread across 3 separate positions, watched the sky over 2 consecutive evenings in 2023. Each team reported the same sequence independently, without coordinating with the others. A large orange orb appeared. It held for 1 to 2 seconds. Then it released smaller red orbs, generally 2 to 4 at a time, witnesses consistently estimating the number as usually 3. The red orbs scattered. Some traveled horizontally. Some moved upward at an angle. Some swooped downward after launch. Then the orange orb disappeared, and the sequence repeated, at least 5 times, across 2 nights, witnessed by separate teams at different vantage points who could not see each other. The file leaves one question explicitly open: whether this was one orange orb performing the same behavior repeatedly, or multiple orange orbs appearing in sequence. What it doesn't leave open is this: 6 trained federal agents at separate positions reported watching the same unusual sequence play out again and again. None of them could identify what they were looking at. The most striking part of the case happened away from the groups. USPER-5 and USPER-6 were alone when they saw it, a large glowing orange orb near a rock pinnacle. Their initial estimate placed it at approximately 500 to 600 meters away, roughly the size of a small helicopter cockpit. A ARO later traveled to the site and measured. Both figures were wrong. The actual distance was closer to 1,050 meters, nearly twice the original estimate. And at that corrected distance, the object was not helicopter cockpit scale. Between 12 and 18 meters in diameter. That is the length of a city bus, hovering, silent, near a rock formation, for approximately 1 minute. USPER-6 noted it almost appeared as though a small spindle connected the object from underneath to the rock below. The object made no sound during the entire sighting. In the official file, USPER-6 described it as seeming to hover with 0 resistance or movement, or to be suspended, and then reached for the closest comparison available: the Eye of Sauron from Lord of the Rings, except without the pupil, or maybe an orange storm electrify bowling ball. That reference is worth pausing on, not for the pop culture, but for what it communicates. This witness was not describing a distant point of light. They were describing something large, round, and visually striking, close enough to compare to a specific object they had held in their hands. Something that hovered silently for a full minute and was later assessed by the Pentagon to be up to 18 meters wide. Then it was gone. The orb sightings happened at dusk. What came next was in the pre-dawn dark. 5 and USPER-6 spotted 2 lights moving along a road inside a restricted zone. 1 red, 1 white, approximately 2 to 3 feet off the ground. Their first assumption was reasonable: an unauthorized vehicle. They pursued it. Within a few hundred feet, the object did something no vehicle could do. It moved off the road laterally, sliding sideways across open desert at 15 to 20 miles per hour, without rotating, without changing its orientation relative to the observers, maintaining the same height throughout. USPER-5 described the movement as having zero resistance. The object traveled approximately 100 meters off the road, stopped, and turned off its lights. In the darkness, what remained was a shape. USPER-5 described an ill-defined dark kite shape with some rounded width to the sides. UER-6, using night vision goggles, caught a split second of visibility before the light cut, and reported what was left as a very thin line, an estimated 4 feet wide, positioned horizontally to the ground. Then it began moving again, same speed, still appearing as a flat line, rising slowly in height until the agents lost sight of it completely. 30 minutes later, USPER-5 and USPER-6 returned to the same area, this time with USPER-7 alongside them, after a report of another unauthorized object nearby. Within a few hundred meters of the first sighting, 2 of the 3 agents saw a second object. USPER-5 through night vision goggles, USPER-6 with the naked eye, USPER-7, standing right beside them, saw nothing. This one was different. It floated approximately 6 meters off the ground, canted at an angle from lower right to upper left, moving slowly, at a speed consistent with the wind. Through the night vision goggles, USPER-5 reported being able to see stars through the object. Faintly, but distinctly, at least partially transparent. USPER-5 then attempted to locate the object using a spotlight. The beam projected normally at first, then, at approximately 50 yards, it stopped. Not blocked, not scattered, just stopped projecting with nothing visibly in the way. When the witness redirected the light back toward the same area, the beam worked normally again. The object was not reacquired. The Western U.S. event contains no photographs of any of the phenomena described. No video, no radar track, no recovered object. The only visuals in the official file are 2 artist renderings and a lights diagram prepared by the Pentagon for the Pursue release. What the file does contain is a structured, corroborated account from 7 trained federal agents operating independently across 2 nights, reporting sequences that matched each other without coordination, describing objects that responded to neither identification nor pursuit, and producing a case that the Pentagon's own analytical office could not explain. AARO traveled to the site, conducted measurements, revised the witness estimates upward, then wrote its conclusion. The reporter's credibility and the potentially anomalous nature of the events themselves combine to make this report among the most compelling within AARO's current holdings. Most compelling? No explanation followed. May 22, 2026 was not an ordinary Friday afternoon. On that day, the U.S. Department of War, the rebranded Pentagon, published its second tranche of declassified UAP material under the Pursue program, the Presidential Unsealing and Reporting System for UAP Encounters, on war.gov/UFO. No security clearance required, no middleman. One click. That afternoon, 2 files stopped the world. The first was ODNI-UAP-D001, a first-person account by a currently serving senior U.S. intelligence officer, describing a series of UAP encounters from a military helicopter in late 2025. The second was DOW-UAP-PR059, official U.S. military infrared footage of what appeared to be a humanoid figure flying through open sky. Released alongside them were a 1973 CIA report on a glowing object photographed over Soviet territory and declassified audio transcripts from the Apollo 12 crew describing streaks of light seen during the 1969 lunar mission. Analysts called May 22, 2026, the most institutionally formal single day of UAP disclosure in modern American history. One of the most detailed modern accounts in the 2026 UAP files came from a senior U.S. intelligence officer. The file was released under the designation ODNI-UAP-D001. It was a first-person narrative. The exact location was not publicly named. The specific military facility was not named. The test range was not named. But the account described a late 2025 mission near a test range in mountainous terrain, following several nights of reported UAP activity in the area. The mission did not begin as a hunt for something unexplained. The team consisted of a senior U.S. intelligence officer, a colleague, and 2 pilots. They departed a joint operations center in a helicopter in the early evening, while daylight still remained. The assignment was straightforward. Find a physical explanation. Loud thuds had been heard in the mountains on the test range. Those sounds coincided with UAP sightings reported over the previous several nights. The team was not sent to chase lights in the sky. They were sent to determine whether debris, wreckage, or any physical object in the mountains could explain what had been seen. The helicopter flew a low-altitude nap of the Earth route through the mountain range for several hours. During the search, the crew spotted debris on the ground multiple times. Each time they descended for a closer look, they found remnants from rockets and other projectiles, the residue of years of weapons testing on the range. That was a good sign. The team was working methodically. Nothing unusual yet. During the search, the crew also discovered a large cave entrance with no visible end. The terrain around the entrance did not allow a safe landing. The officer instructed the pilot to orbit the cave several times for observation, noted the coordinates, and continued the mission. As fuel ran low, the helicopter headed to a prearranged rendezvous point. A ground team was waiting. The officer's colleague got out. The senior intelligence officer remained aboard with the 2 pilots, and the helicopter proceeded to a pre-positioned tanker on the range for refueling. The plan after refueling was to return to base. That plan changed. The Joint Operations Center radioed with a new request. A ground team had spotted debris on a nearby mountain, and the helicopter was asked to search the area. By then, the sun had set. The pilots switched to forward-looking infrared, or FLIR, and night vision goggles, or NVGs. The senior intelligence officer continued using the unaided naked eye. The helicopter searched the mountain. Nothing was found. Then the JOC sent a new message. Radar had detected hits several miles uprange from the helicopter's position, the same area where UAP activity had been reported on previous nights. The officer relayed the information to the pilots. The helicopter altered course to intercept. What followed lasted more than an hour. The first active report came from the ground teams. While the helicopter was en route, the ground teams reported spotting a UAP on FLIR. They described it as super hot, low to the ground, moving east, then hurtling south at high speed. Then it split into two and changed direction. When the helicopter arrived in the area, the crew scanned using NVGs, FLIR, and the naked eye. The ground team then radioed one of the most dramatic details in the report. They said the object had risen from the ground, approached within 10 feet of the helicopter, dropped below it, and then sped away. The pilots saw the object through night vision goggles. They reported seeing it split into two as a smaller object emerged from it before it accelerated out of sight. The helicopter gave chase. It was no use. The object covered more than 20 miles at a speed no helicopter on Earth could match. One moment it was there. The next, it was gone. The JOC directed the helicopter to a new set of radar coordinates. The officer relayed the position to the pilots. The helicopter moved to intercept and hovered at approximately 700 feet above ground level. From that position, the crew saw a large number of orange orbs in the distance. The file describes them as countless orange orbs swarming in all directions against the backdrop of the mountain. The display lasted several minutes before fading. The JOC redirected the helicopter back toward its previous position based on fresh radar hits. The helicopter hovered again at approximately 700 feet above ground level. Then the closest visual orb formation appeared. Through night vision goggles, the pilots saw the objects. The senior intelligence officer saw them with the naked eye. Two large orbs flared up side by side, close to the helicopter, just above the rotor disc, to the right of the aircraft. The orbs were oval-shaped. They were orange, with a white or yellow center. They emitted light in all directions. After a few seconds, a third orb flared up below the pair. Then a fourth appeared below that. The formation became 4 or 5 orbs, arranged in a T shape beneath the original 2. The orbs remained stationary. Then they dimmed in reverse order and vanished. The entire event lasted about 10 to 15 seconds. The officer did not take photographs. According to the file, the reason was that the officer was focused entirely on assessing what the objects were and whether they posed a threat. After the formation appeared at such close range, the pilots briefly considered landing. They decided instead to remain hovering at 700 feet for further observation. Then the fighter jets became visible. The helicopter crew saw the jets entering visual range at approximately 23,000 feet above ground level, identifiable by their blinking navigation lights. The JOC had requested the jets' assistance in identifying the UAP. As the jets moved through the area, the same type of orbs appeared above them. The orbs flared up one at a time in a horizontal formation. They matched the jet's speed and flight path exactly. After about 10 to 15 seconds, the orbs dimmed sequentially and disappeared. This repeated several times as the jets transited the airspace and eventually landed. The senior intelligence officer remarked to the pilots that it seemed the same type of orbs encountered near the helicopter were now chasing the fighter jets. The crew also observed orange orbs flaring up and down around the helicopter for several more minutes. In one sequence, the orbs formed a distinct triangle before vanishing. By the end of the encounter, the helicopter was again low on fuel. the pilots decided to return to the Joint Operations Center. The senior intelligence officer's account ended with a single sentence, one that became the most quoted line in the entire Pursue release. "We were virtually speechless after these observations." Released on the same afternoon, a second file drew a different kind of silence. Designated DOW-UAP-PR 059 with the internal title NAGUAP1 June 20, the file contained short infrared footage captured by U.S. military imaging equipment in June 2020. The technology used was the same thermal sensor system employed by U.S. military aircraft to track targets in low-light conditions. What it captured was a single bright humanoid silhouette suspended in midair against a darker sky, roughly 2 meters tall, appearing to hold an object in one hand. Then it accelerated upward and vanished from the frame. The clip runs only a few seconds. The Department of War stated that the footage remains unresolved. No official explanation was offered. Researchers noted that the silhouette bore a striking resemblance to an unresolved civilian sighting from Sequoia National Park in 2015, a case that had never been explained. The government did not claim to know what it was. The limitations of ODNI-UAP-D001 are clear. The file does not publicly name the location. It does not name the military facility. It does not include photographs taken by the senior intelligence officer. It does not include a public radar track in the narrative itself. It does not provide a recovered object. What it does provide is a detailed first-person account from a currently serving senior U.S. intelligence officer, one involving a helicopter crew, ground teams, radar detections, FLIR observations, night vision sightings, fighter jets, and multiple formations of orange orbs during a late 2025 mission. The reported objects appeared across multiple contexts in a single night. Near the ground, within 10 feet of a helicopter, against the backdrop of a mountain range, above fighter jets, circling the helicopter itself. The reported behavior changed throughout the encounter. One object was described as super hot on flare. One rose from the ground and closed to within 10 feet of the aircraft. One split into two as a smaller object emerged. Others appeared in groups, arranging themselves into a T, mirroring the speed and heading of fighter jets in a horizontal formation, and later forming a triangle near the helicopter. This was not a single light seen once. According to the released narrative, it was an extended sequence of radar tasking, multi-sensor observations, ground team reports, helicopter sightings, and fighter jet activity lasting more than an hour. And when it was over, a senior intelligence officer of the world's most powerful nation, a person whose career is built on assessing threats, evaluating evidence, and maintaining composure under pressure, reduced the entire experience to one sentence. "We were virtually speechless after these observations." New Mexico, 1948. Something was flying over America's nuclear weapons, not once, not twice. Between 1948 and 1950, personnel at Sandia Base recorded 209 separate sightings of unexplained aerial objects, green orbs, disks, and fireballs, over and around the most sensitive military installations in the United States. Los Alamos was nearby. Kirtland Field was nearby. White Sands was nearby. This was the landscape where America had built the atomic bomb, and where it was now building everything that came after. The men working there were not the type to panic over lights in the sky. They were scientists, engineers, and military officers with the highest security clearances in the country. When they started filing reports, the government took it seriously. Seriously enough to call a conference. In February 1949, a meeting was convened at Los Alamos. The attendees included Edward Teller, one of the key architects of the hydrogen bomb, along with members of the Air Force's Project Sign and specialists in atmospheric physics. Their task was simple: figure out what was producing the green fireballs appearing repeatedly over nuclear facilities in New Mexico. They couldn't do it. The sightings continued. The green fireball problem, as it became known inside military and scientific circles, had no explanation that satisfied the people closest to it. These were not distant lights seen by civilians. They were objects observed repeatedly by trained personnel over the most restricted airspace in America, and nobody could say what they were. Then, on July 24th, 1949, a fireball appeared near Socorro, New Mexico. This time, the investigators decided to look for physical evidence. The morning after the fireball, July 25th, 1949, at 10 a.m., a team began collecting air samples along its estimated flight path. The equipment they used drew air at approximately 34 liters per minute, forcing airborne particles onto adhesive-coated collection plates. The adhesive contained a chemical called rubianic acid, a reagent designed specifically to detect copper and copper compounds. After collection, the slides were exposed to ammonia vapor to reveal any copper particles captured. The first results came back. Copper. Large particles, some measuring over 100 microns. Smaller ones in the range of 20 to 30 microns. At least one copper reaction was visible even before the ammonia treatment, suggesting soluble copper already present in the sampled air. Here is why that matters. Copper is one of the rarest elements found in meteorites. If the fireball had been an ordinary meteor burning up in the atmosphere, copper would not be what investigators expected to find. Its presence in air collected along the path of a green fireball over a nuclear weapons facility was not a result that fit the standard explanation. Lincoln La Paz, director of the Institute of Meteoritics at the University of New Mexico and one of the foremost meteor experts in the country, treated it as potentially significant for exactly that reason. This was not nothing. The team kept collecting samples over the following 8 days. What they found shifted over time. Early collections contained large particles. Later ones contained smaller particles in greater quantities. One collection, taken 145 hours after the fireball, captured 140 particles in a 5-minute run, most of them between 2 and 5 microns in size. That created a problem. A particle that small cannot fall more than 10,000 feet in 145 hours without being carried downward by air movement. The timing didn't add up without detailed atmospheric data the investigators didn't have. The pattern of what was appearing, and when, was difficult to explain. Then came the cobalt. In one collection from July 26th, investigators found 3 particles that tested strongly for cobalt. They were nearly perfect spheres, approximately 12 microns in diameter. The investigators noted they had never encountered anything like them before in field collection work. 2 nickel indications were also found in the same samples. Perfectly spherical cobalt particles, recovered from air samples, collected along the flight path of a green fireball, over a nuclear weapons facility. The investigators had never seen anything like them. To their credit, the team was careful about what they concluded. The official assessment stated directly that it would be hazardous to draw any definite conclusion associating the copper-bearing particles with the July 24th fireball. There was a separate collection on Highway 84, north of Albuquerque, that returned a large number of copper particles, but 2 cars had passed during collection, and the team could not rule out contamination from the road. That result was set aside. what remained was harder to dismiss. The smallest particles, the ones that couldn't simply have blown up from the surface, didn't appear in quantity until approximately 35 hours after the fireball. Their timing, their size, and their composition created questions the investigators could not answer with the data they had. The proposed next step was ambitious: mount collection equipment on an aircraft capable of flying above 40,000 feet, deploy it immediately after the next fireball event, and sample the air along the trajectory before anything from the ground could contaminate the results. There is no record that this was ever done. The file released in 2026, DOW-UAP-D017, runs 116 pages. It came from the Armed Forces Special Weapons Program, the direct military successor to the Manhattan Project. It covers 2 years of sightings, 1 physical investigation, and a set of chemical results that the investigators themselves described as unresolved. Here is what the record actually shows. 209 sightings of unexplained aerial objects over America's nuclear weapons facilities. A formal scientific investigation that found copper in the air where a fireball had been. Cobalt spheres unlike anything the investigators had seen before. A timeline of particle appearance that didn't fit simple contamination. And a follow-up investigation. Aircraft sampling above 40,000 feet that was proposed, planned, and apparently never carried out. The copper was real. The cobalt spheres were real. The association with the fireball was never proven, but it was never closed either. A Cold War-era military investigation conducted by the successors to the Manhattan Project over the facilities that held America's nuclear arsenal. They found something in the air they couldn't explain. They proposed a way to find out more. Then the record goes quiet. The pattern started becoming clear around the third file. Not 1 nuclear facility, not 2. Across multiple decades, across multiple agencies, the same type of location kept appearing in the UAP record: nuclear weapons plants, atomic research sites, the classified infrastructure built around America's most sensitive technology. The 2026 Pursue release didn't introduce this connection, but it documented it formally in a public multi-agency release for the first time. 3 Department of Energy files, 3 separate decades, 1 pattern that nobody has officially explained. The first file is the most direct. DOE-UAP-D001. Title: Enhanced Pantex Imagery. The Pantex plant sits roughly 17 miles northeast of Amarillo, Texas. It is the primary facility in the United States for assembling, disassembling, maintaining, and storing nuclear warheads, including plutonium pits removed from dismantled weapons. It operates inside the National Nuclear Security Administration's nuclear security enterprise. Its security posture is among the most stringent of any facility in the country. Any unidentified object near Pantex is not a routine matter. The file is 2 pages. The first shows an image from a ground surveillance radar tower, a small object circled in red, with a large section below it redacted under UCNI markings. Unclassified controlled nuclear information. The record came from a nuclear security environment, even if the document itself isn't fully classified. The second page shows Sandia National Laboratory's enhanced images of the same object. A dark, irregular shape against a pale background, with a blur around its edges. No date, no time, no altitude, no speed, no flight path. What earlier reporting had already established filled part of that gap. Security personnel at Pantex had described the object as diamond-shaped, more round at the top. They were dispatched to track it. They followed it for several miles before it disappeared. The object was tracked by ground radar, photographed, and the images were sent to Sandia National Laboratories for analysis. The most significant details of what Sandia found remain redacted. This was not the first time something unexplained appeared near Pantex. In November 1957, eyewitnesses reported 3 disc-shaped craft with bright-colored lights hovering near the plant. Nearly 70 years passed between that report and the 2026 file. The location was the same. The object was still unidentified, and the most important details were still being withheld. The second file moves from security imagery to scientific correspondence. DOE-UAP-D002. The James Tuck Correspondence, 1970s. James Leslie Tuck was not a casual observer. He was a physicist with deep roots in the atomic program. He had worked with the British mission during the Manhattan Project and later contributed to fusion research at Los Alamos. When he turned his attention to UAP-related questions in the 1970s, he didn't approach it through speculation. He approached it through physics. One key document is dated December 16, 1970. In it, Tuck wrote to the U.S. Army Engineering School at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, asking for what he called the recipe used in simulated atomic bomb demonstrations. His reason was specific. He was interested in the large atmospheric vortices those demonstrations were known to produce, documented in the government-commissioned Condon study on UFOs from the late 1960s, because he believed those vortices might help explain categories of unusual aerial observations. He wasn't asking for recovered alien materials. He wasn't speculating about extraterrestrial craft. He was a physicist who had helped build nuclear weapons, asking a military institution for technical specifications of a known demonstration because he thought the atmospheric physics involved might be relevant to UAP phenomena. Other pages in the correspondence reference ball lightning and include material from a 1976 book on UAP propulsion. Within a few documents, the file gathers atomic blast simulations, large-scale atmospheric vortices, ball lightning behavior, and questions about how UAP move, handled not through rumor, but through the methods of a working scientist. Tuck never claimed to know what UAP were. What the file shows is that someone with his background thought the question was worth pursuing properly, and that he had access to the resources to do it. The third file is a single page. DOE-UAP-D003, dated May 20th, 1986. It came from the Pajarito Astronomers, a group based in Los Alamos, New Mexico, announcing a meeting to be held on May 29th at Fuller Lodge. The guest speaker was listed as Dr. John Warren of AT-6. The announced topic was straightforward. Why should a scientist be concerned about UFOs? That question, asked in Los Alamos in 1986, carries weight because of where it was asked. Los Alamos was the birthplace of the atomic bomb. It had been at the center of the green fireball investigations of the late 1940s, the 209 sightings, the copper particles, the cobalt spheres, the follow-up investigation that was proposed and apparently never completed. It had hosted classified conferences on unexplained aerial phenomena in 1949, attended by Edward Teller and the Air Force's own investigative teams. And in 1986, 37 years after those investigations, a group of scientists affiliated with the same community was still meeting formally to ask whether the subject deserved serious attention. The answer had not arrived in 1949. It had not arrived in 1970, when James Tuck was writing letters to Army engineering schools about atmospheric vortices. It had not arrived by May 29, 1986, when whoever showed up to Fuller Lodge sat down to hear Dr. John Warren speak. 3 files, 3 decades. The 1980s Pantex imagery, with its redacted Sandia analysis. The 1970s Tuck correspondence pursuing UAP through the tools of atomic physics. The 1986 Los Alamos meeting, where scientists were still asking whether any of this was worth taking seriously. What connects them is not a single dramatic event. It is something quieter and harder to dismiss. The fact that the people closest to America's nuclear program kept returning to this subject across decades through official channels using the methods of their own fields. They were not believers chasing something they wanted to find. They were scientists and security professionals doing what they were trained to do, following the evidence in front of them, asking the next question, and writing it down. The written record made it to 2026. The answers did not. These were not civilians looking up from a field. They were the most rigorously selected, most extensively trained human beings the United States government had ever put into space. Pilots, engineers, scientists, people whose careers depended on precise observation and accurate reporting, people who understood better than anyone what they were looking at when they looked out a window, and what they weren't. Between 1962 and 1974, NASA ran 4 major human spaceflight programs back-to-back. Mercury was the first, 6 solo missions that proved Americans could survive in space at all. Gemini came next, 10 missions that tested the techniques needed to reach the moon, including spacewalks and orbital docking. Apollo was the moon program itself, 12 crewed missions between 1968 and 1972, 6 of which landed on the lunar surface. And Skylab was America's first space station, hosting 3 separate crews in 1973 and 1974, before the station was abandoned. Across all 4 programs, several crews reported things they could not explain. The reports stayed inside NASA's archives for decades. The 2026 Pursue release put them in the public record for the first time. Gemini 7. December 4th, 1965. Frank Borman and Jim Lovell launched on the 10th crewed American spaceflight. Approximately 4.5 hours into the mission, Borman radioed Mission Control with 4 words. "I've got a bogey at 10 o'clock high." Houston asked him to repeat. Borman described hundreds of small particles visible through the window, approximately 3 to 4 miles from the capsule. Lovell added his own description, a brilliant body in the sun against a black background, with what he called trillions of particles around it. The Pursue file includes both the audio recording of that exchange and the written transcript. In the top right corner of the transcript, someone had written a note by hand. UFO, sighting by Borman. Both Borman and Lovell maintained throughout their lives that what they reported was debris, most likely from the mission's own separated rocket stage. That explanation is reasonable. It is also the explanation 2 astronauts chose for themselves, unprompted, about something they had seen firsthand. The handwritten annotation stayed in the file. The file stayed archived until May 8, 2026. Apollo 11, July 1969. The first moon landing. The technical crew debriefing filed after the mission documented 3 separate observations that did not fit neatly into the mission record. On the journey outbound, Buzz Aldrin reported an object with what he described as a sizable dimension, visible about 1 day from Earth. The crew examined it through a monocular and discussed whether it might be the separated Saturn V rocket stage. They could not confirm it. They noted it in the debrief and moved on. During the mission, Aldrin reported small flashes of light inside the darkened cabin while trying to sleep. appearing roughly 2 minutes apart with no obvious source. On the return trip, the crew observed a bright light source they tentatively described as a possible laser. What is notable about the Apollo 11 debriefing is not any single observation. It is how the crew handled uncertainty. They reported everything. They proposed explanations. They marked those explanations as provisional. They left the record open where certainty wasn't available. 3 of the most scrutinized human beings on Earth, returning from the moon, filing a careful account of things they weren't sure about. Apollo 12. November 1969. The second lunar landing. Lunar Module Pilot. Alan Bean reported particles and flashes visible through the Alignment Optical Telescope on the 5th mission day, describing them as sailing off into space and escaping the moon. Mission Commander Pete Conrad reported floating debris outside the module on the 6th day, illuminated by the tracking light until the light appeared to burn out. The Pursue files also included annotated lunar surface photographs from Apollo 12. Highlighted areas labeled Area 1 through Area 5 show faint points of light above the lunar horizon. The files note the highlighting was contextual, identifying areas of interest, not analytical conclusions. Points of light above the surface of the moon. Noted. Filed. Archived. Apollo 17. December 1972. The final crewed lunar mission. On the first day, Command Module pilot Ronald Evans reported bright particles and fragments drifting near the spacecraft during maneuvers. Lunar Module pilot Harrison Schmitt described the scene as looking like the 4th of July. The crew speculated the particles were ice or paint chips from the separated rocket stage. In the official record, they described that speculation as a wild guess. On the second day, Mission Commander Gene Cernan reported difficulty sleeping. He described sets of streaks and then an intense single flash of light between his eyes, comparing its brightness to a train headlight. Over the following 3 hours, Cernan reported several flashing, rotating phenomena that he assessed as physical objects in space rather than internal visual effects. Harrison Schmitt, observing the same period from nearby, attributed the source to the separated rocket stage. Both assessments went into the record. Neither was confirmed. Apollo 17 also produced an unexpected scientific result. Dick Henry, a co-investigator on the ultraviolet experiment, reported a spectral reading above the dark count that resembled the signature of a hot star in a field of view that contained no hot stars. The conservative interpretation pointed to galactic starlight reflecting off interstellar dust. Henry noted that some characteristics didn't fit that explanation. He noted that extragalactic radiation was at least possible. Then there is the photograph. A December 1972 image from the mission shows 3 distinct dots arranged in a triangular formation in the lower right quadrant of the lunar sky, clearly visible when magnified. The photograph had been sitting in public archives for decades before anyone flagged it formally. The Department of War's annotation in the 2026 release was precise. There is no consensus on the nature of the anomaly. It then added that preliminary U.S. government analysis suggested the image feature was potentially the result of a physical object in the scene, and that the original Apollo 17 film had been obtained for further analysis by NASA and the Department of War. Results to be released when the investigation is complete. That photograph is not a closed historical file. It is an active government case. Skylab, 1973 to 1974. 3 separate crews. 3 separate sets of observations. Skylab 2, Science pilot Joseph Kerwin reported light flashes seen most often at night with his eyes closed, waxing and waning in frequency. Skylab 3 science pilot Owen Garriott tracked a bright reddish object for 5 to 10 minutes before splashdown, assessing it as a satellite in a similar orbit, and separately reported a large red object through the wardroom window, brighter than Jupiter, that he could not account for. Skylab 4. Commander Gerald Carr reported flashing lights outside the station with definite motion relative to it, which the crew presumed were debris or other satellites. Presumed, not confirmed. The Mercury audio excerpts, added in the second Pursue release, went back even further. May 24, 1962. Scott Carpenter aboard Aurora, 7 described white particles moving randomly outside the capsule, some appearing to move faster than the spacecraft itself. October 3, 1962. Wally Schirra aboard Sigma 7 described small white objects departing the capsule and an unidentified burst of light in the window. May 15, 1963. Gordon Cooper and Faith. 7 reported the same phenomenon John Glenn had described before him. White particles with a distinctive appearance that NASA later determined were frozen condensation separating from the spacecraft, with sunlight reflecting off them. Most observations had explanations. Many of those explanations held. Some did not fully fit. Across 12 years of American spaceflight, the people who actually left Earth filed careful, provisional accounts of things they saw and couldn't always identify. Most of it stayed in NASA's archives. The 2026 release put it in front of the public for the first time. One photograph from 1972 is still being analyzed by the U.S. government today. The astronauts did their job. They observed, they reported, they left the record open. More than 50 years later, the people who inherited that record are still working through what it means. The modern UAP story did not begin with military videos leaked online. It did not begin with congressional hearings or whistleblowers. It began on a Tuesday afternoon in June 1947, when a civilian pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying over Washington state and saw something he could not explain. Arnold spotted 9 shiny objects moving near Mount Rainier at speeds he estimated at over 1,200 miles per hour. No aircraft of that era came close to that speed. His account hit the press the next morning, and within days, sighting reports were flooding in from across the United States. The term flying saucer was born. What most people do not know is that the FBI was watching from the start. The Bureau's internal case file on unidentified aerial objects, designated 62-HQ-83894, stretches from 1947 to 1968. It runs across 18 separate documents in the 2026 release, with fewer redactions and several newly declassified pages that had never been seen publicly before. The file is not a record of skepticism. It is a record of a government that took these reports seriously, routed them through official channels, and in many cases never gave a satisfying explanation for what was found. The file opens with Arnold. His typed account survived inside a counterintelligence course field report. That detail matters. The FBI archive did not start with rumors. It started at the very moment the modern flying saucer era was born, and it never stopped. Then came Roswell. On July 8, 1947, at 6:17 in the evening, a one-page teletype marked urgent left the FBI's Dallas field office. The sender was Special Agent Percy Wiley, special agent in charge of the Dallas office, relaying a phone call from Major Edwin M. Curtin of Army Air Force Intelligence at Fort Worth. Something had been recovered near Roswell, New Mexico. The object, Curtin told Wiley, was hexagonal in shape, not round, not a simple disc, but six-sided, suspended from a 20-foot balloon by a cable. It was being flown to Wright Field in Ohio for examination. To the press that same afternoon, Curtin said it was a weather balloon. But what he said to a federal agent inside an official government communication on the same day the story broke, that was something different. The shape he described does not match a weather balloon. It doesn't match a radar reflector. It does not match anything in the standard Air Force inventory of the era. That teletype is now public record. When a researcher tracked down Percy Wiley in 1981 and asked him directly about it, Wiley refused to discuss it. He ended the conversation with a single sentence. "I've had no unexplained fires in my garage," he said, "and I have had no men in black visit me." Then he hung up. A man who spent his career sending urgent federal communications about what the military recovered from the New Mexico desert, and 34 years later, the only thing he would say was that no one had come after him yet. 3 years after the Dallas teletype, a very different document entered the FBI file. On March 22, 1950, Guy Hotel, special agent in charge of the FBI's Washington field office, sent a memo directly to Director J. Edgar Hoover. The subject line read, "Flying Saucers." Hotel wrote that an Air Force investigator had reported that 3 so-called flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico. Each was circular in shape, with a raised center, approximately 50 feet in diameter. Each one was occupied by 3 bodies of human shape, only 3 feet tall, dressed in metallic cloth of a very fine texture. Each body was bandaged in a manner similar to the blackout suits worn by speed flyers and test pilots. The FBI would later call this memo third-hand information. A claim they never investigated, something that may have originated with a con man. But consider what it actually says. An Air Force investigator, not a civilian, not a tabloid reporter, not a UFO enthusiast, told someone that 3 craft had been recovered. 3 separate craft, each with 3 bodies inside. Bodies that were dressed. Bodies that were bandaged. Someone had taken the time to put flight suits on them. That is not the description of wreckage. That is the description of a crew. The FBI says it never followed up. That itself is a detail worth sitting with. On the same day Roswell made headlines, July 8, 1947, 5 Army Air Forces personnel at Muroc Army Airfield gave sworn statements about disc sightings. Muroc was the dry lake test base that would later become Edwards Air Force Base, the most restricted flight test facility in the United States. 2 separate sightings, only hours apart, from military witnesses inside one of the most sensitive installations in the country. Their statements went into official files and stayed there for decades. Roswell was not an isolated event. July 1947 was a wave, and it was happening on military ground. The file then moves to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, one of the most protected sites in the American atomic system. In January 1951, 2 Air Force aircraft obtained a radar lock on an unidentified target near the facility and made 3 intercept passes, each time guided toward a specific point on the ground. The official explanation was temperature inversion, atmospheric conditions creating a false radar return. 3 intercept passes, guided each time to the same point on the ground for a temperature inversion. Oak Ridge also produced a photographic case from July 1947. A man named William Presley, living at 218 Illinois Avenue in Oak Ridge, photographed what he believed was a flying object near the most sensitive nuclear installation in the United States. The photographs and negatives were forwarded through the Atomic Energy Commission to the Air Materiel Command's Technical Intelligence Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the same facility where Roswell debris was sent. A formal written analysis followed, signed by Colonel C.D. Gasser. The photographs were taken near a nuclear site. They were routed through the atomic energy system. They ended up at Wright-Patterson. Whatever Presley saw that day, the government treated it as worth the full formal chain of analysis. The Rhodes photographs from Phoenix tell a similar story, with a darker ending. On July 7th, 1947, one day before Roswell made headlines, William Albert Rhodes photographed 2 unidentified objects over Phoenix. The images became some of the most discussed early flying disc photographs of the era. Rhodes handed the negatives to Army Air Force's intelligence. He never got them back. What survives in the FBI archive is years of memos between the FBI, the Office of Special Investigations, and Air Force intelligence, each trying to establish who had the negatives and what could be said publicly. The paper trail goes cold. A civilian photographed something, handed over his evidence to the government at their request, and the government kept it. No verdict, no return, no explanation. By the 1960s, the pressure was building. A 1966 FBI memo noted the growing controversy around Frank Edwards's book, Flying Saucers, Serious Business, and the mounting calls for congressional hearings. The public was no longer willing to accept weather balloons and temperature inversions. Researchers were asking questions the Air Force could not comfortably answer. Files that had been quietly accumulating inside federal agencies for 2 decades were suddenly a political problem. The archive that began with Kenneth Arnold's sighting over Mount Rainier in June 1947 ran for more than 20 years, through Roswell, through Oak Ridge, through Phoenix, through the atomic age. It collected pilot statements, radar contacts, sworn military testimony, photographs taken near nuclear facilities, and bodies described in metallic cloth. It collected a special agent who, 34 years after sending the most important teletype of his career, would only say that no one had come to burn his garage down. None of it was explained. All of it was filed away. It took until 2026 to read it. The 2026 UFO files did not stop at American borders. They crossed them. What emerged from the State Department cables and CIA intelligence files was something the public had never been given access to before. A global picture. UAP reports moving through embassies, through diplomatic pouches, through Cold War intelligence networks, through airline crew debriefs and foreign military disputes. The same phenomenon that U.S. military pilots were reporting over the Pacific was being logged by commercial pilots over Kazakhstan, by radar operators over Papua New Guinea, and by a former Soviet citizen standing outside a weapons testing range in the dark, watching the sky do something it had no business doing. 5 countries, 4 decades, 1 pattern. The first cable came from Papua New Guinea, January 28, 1985. The U.S. Embassy in Port Moresby sent a cable after something moved through Papua New Guinea airspace 4 nights earlier. The Papua New Guinea National Intelligence Organization had contacted the embassy directly. The reason it reached intelligence level was straightforward. An officer in Wewak reported that local residents had been frightened by overflights. The situation escalated fast. The provincial premier called a public meeting. The prime minister, who happened to be in his electoral district at the time, attended. That is the detail that matters. This was not a fringe sighting, logged by a civilian and filed away. It was serious enough to pull a sitting head of government into a public meeting to address his constituents. Reports described fast-moving objects with lights, contrails, and noise. An Air Niugini pilot who had just taken off from Wewak said his radar picked up aircraft flying from south to north at high altitude and high speed. Other visual reports came from across the country. A single aircraft moving north to south at 7 p.m., then 6 to 8 aircraft traveling in the opposite direction at 10 p.m. The U.S. Embassy told Papua New Guinea officials it knew of no B-52 overflights and no U.S. aircraft in Papua New Guinea airspace on January 24th. Then it asked military command in Honolulu to confirm that and provide any explanation it could. No explanation appears in the file. 9 years later, the cables moved to Central Asia. January 27, 1994. A Boeing 747 SP operated by Tajik Air was cruising at 41,000 feet over Kazakhstan. The crew included the chief pilot, an American citizen named Ed Rhodes, and 2 other American colleagues, all veterans of Pan Am, men who between them had accumulated thousands of flight hours over every ocean on Earth. Something appeared on the eastern horizon, a light of enormous intensity coming in at a much higher altitude than the aircraft, moving fast. The crew watched it for 40 minutes. During that time, the object executed circles, corkscrews, and 90-degree turns, rapid, precise, under what the crew described as very high G-forces. Captain Rhodes took photographs with a pocket Olympus camera. The crew described the light as having a bow wave, like a high-speed photograph of a bullet in flight, where the shock wave around the projectile is almost larger than the projectile itself. They could not determine the object's shape because it was dark, but the disturbance around it was visible and distinct. About 45 minutes after the first sighting, as the sun began to rise, the aircraft flew directly underneath the contrails the object had left behind. The 747 was traveling at more than 500 knots. Rhodes estimated the contrails were at approximately 100,000 feet, more than 3 times the cruising altitude of a commercial aircraft, higher than a U-2 spy plane, above the operational ceiling of almost anything that has ever flown. He also noted there was too little air and moisture at that altitude for conventional propulsion to produce contrails at all. When embassy personnel suggested the object might have been a meteor skipping off the atmosphere, Rhodes and his crew rejected it immediately. They had seen thousands of meteors and pieces of falling space debris in their careers. This was not that. The cable ended carefully, as diplomatic cables do. The embassy stated it had no opinion and was reporting the account for what it was worth. The photographs Rhodes promised to send were never mentioned again in the file. Contrails at 100,000 feet, left by something unknown, witnessed by experienced aviation professionals over Central Asia, photographed, and then quietly filed away. The Georgia cable told a different kind of story. October 30th, 2001. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow sent a cable about Georgian accusations that Russian aircraft had violated Georgian airspace and bombed areas of the Kadori Gorge 2 days earlier. Russia denied any involvement. A Russian Foreign Ministry official, asked to explain what aircraft had been seen in the area, said the reports might as well have been about UFOs. The U.S. cable was blunt. It said it was hard to accept official Russian denials, and that calling the aircraft UFOs would be humorous if the airspace violations were not serious. This file matters for a different reason than the others. It shows how UFO language can enter official government records, not because anyone believes in alien craft, but because a government is trying to make an inconvenient fact disappear. The word UFO, in this case, was not a description. It was a deflection. The Turkmenistan cable was stranger still. November 2004. The U.S. Embassy in Ashgabat filed a diplomatic report on a civil society organization called the Union of Ufologists of Turkmenabat. The group had more than 1,000 members, lawyers, scientists, accountants, computer experts, teachers. It had originally been established to study the possibility of life on other planets, but had since become a functioning civil society organization, helping small businesses and supporting local NGOs. Its president, Ovesberdi Muradov, told the embassy that the Turkmen military and government authorities had consulted him about mysterious occurrences in Turkmen airspace. He said there had been no confirmed UFO sightings in Turkmenistan. But the military was asking him questions. A government's own military consulting a UFO organization about unexplained activity in its airspace. That sentence sat inside a classified diplomatic cable for more than 20 years before anyone outside the embassy could read it. The Mexico cable arrived in 2023. September 12th of that year, the Mexican Congress heard testimony on UAP from journalist Jaime Maussan and former U.S. Navy pilot Ryan Graves, who had previously testified before the U.S. Congress on the same subject. The hearing concerned proposed language in an aerial space protection law. If approved, it would make Mexico the first country to formally acknowledge the presence of alien life on Earth. 2 alleged alien corpses were presented in the chamber. Ryan Graves publicly distanced himself from the display afterward. He called the alleged bodies an unsubstantiated stunt that pulled attention away from serious pilot experiences with UAP. Scientists later discredited Maussan's previous alleged alien remains. The U.S. Embassy cable recorded all of it: the testimony, the bodies, the backlash, and the controversy, and filed it as part of a routine weekly political report. Then there was the CIA file. CIA-UAP-D001 was an intelligence report on the Soviet Sari-Shagan weapons testing range in Kazakhstan, a facility used to test experimental missiles, where rumored laser weapons research was also underway. The report was sourced from a former Soviet citizen with apparent first-hand knowledge of the site. It covered range security, missile systems, warhead operations, and facility layouts. Section 14 contained something else entirely. One evening in late summer 1973, the source stepped outside Site 7, the warhead checkout headquarters, while a Canada-USSR sports broadcast played inside. He looked up. In the western sky, at an estimated angle of 70 degrees, there was a bright green circular object. The sky was clear. No clouds, no sound. Within 10 to 15 seconds, the green circle began to widen. Concentric rings formed around it, one after another, expanding outward like ripples on water. Within minutes, the color faded. The rings dissolved. Whatever it was, it left in silence. The source gave no opinion on what he had seen. The CIA gave no conclusion. The report had existed in a heavily redacted form since 1978. The 2026 release put a fuller version in public hands for the first time. A former Soviet citizen. A weapons testing range. A green light that grew rings and disappeared into a clear sky without a sound. 50 years inside a classified file before anyone outside the agency could read it in full. 5 countries, 5 cables, 4 decades of reports moving through diplomatic and intelligence channels that were never meant to be read by the public. Papua New Guinea, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Turkmenistan, Mexico, and a CIA source standing outside a Soviet missile range on a quiet evening in 1973. The governments watching were different. The languages were different. The channels were different. The phenomenon kept appearing anyway. The Lake Huron file did not enter the Pursue release because the government chose to open it. It entered because Congress asked to see it. On March 6, 2026, 8 members of the U.S. House of Representatives formally requested access to 51 potentially UAP-related records held by the Department of War and the intelligence community. AARO identified responsive materials on a classified network and began the declassification review process. The Lake Huron footage had been sitting on that network for 3 years, since the day the F-16 brought the object down. It was not released until Congress put the request in writing. That is why you are seeing it now. Not because the government was ready to explain it, because Congress asked to look. On the afternoon of February 12, 2023, a U.S. Air National Guard F-16C launched from Madison, Wisconsin, on an intercept mission over Lake Huron. The pilot carried 2 AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles. The target was flying at 20,000 feet, high enough to constitute a direct hazard to commercial aviation. The order was to bring it down. The first missile missed. The second struck the object at approximately 2:42 p.m. Central Standard Time. The object disintegrated. Its wreckage fell into the lake below. Search teams from the U.S. Coast Guard and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police combed the shoreline and the water. What they found, if anything, was never made public. For 3 years, the Pentagon said nothing. No footage, no analysis, no public accounting of what an F-16 had destroyed over one of the largest bodies of fresh water in the world. That changed on May 22, 2026. To understand why this case sits apart from every other file in the Pursue release, it is necessary to understand the 8 days that preceded it. On February 4, 2023, a Chinese high-altitude surveillance balloon was shot down off the coast of South Carolina by an F-22 Raptor from the 1st Fighter Wing, using an AIM-9X missile. That engagement was well documented. The balloon had spent days crossing the continental United States. The government acknowledged it, tracked it publicly, and recovered significant debris from the Atlantic. 6 days later, on February 10th, a second object, described by officials as cylindrical and silver gray, was intercepted and destroyed over Alaska by an F-22 launched from Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. A day after that, on February 11th, a third unidentified object was shot down over Canada's Yukon Territory by another U.S. Air Force F-22, operating in coordination with Canadian authorities. Then came Lake Huron on February 12th. 4 shootdowns in 8 days. The first had an identification. The other 3 did not. The United States military was engaging and destroying unidentified aerial objects at a pace without precedent in American history. And with each engagement, the formal description of what was destroyed became less specific, not more. The Lake Huron object had first been detected on radar over Montana on February 11th. It disappeared, then reappeared the following day, flying over Wisconsin at 20,000 feet before entering airspace over Lake Huron. NORAD coordinated the intercept. The FAA issued a temporary flight restriction over Lake Michigan at approximately noon to clear civilian air traffic from the engagement area. The F-16C that carried out the intercept belonged to the 148th Fighter Wing. The Bulldogs, operating under the call sign AESIR. It was equipped with a Sniper Advanced Targeting Pod, which provided the infrared sensor recording later declassified in the Pursue release. The pilot fired the first AIM-9X. It missed. Each AIM-9X costs approximately $400,000. The pilot fired a second. It connected. After the engagement, Pentagon officials were asked to describe what had been destroyed. The object, they said, was octagonal in shape, with multiple strings hanging below it, and no discernible payload. It had no visible propulsion system. Officials noted that its shape may have made it difficult for conventional radar to characterize, and that the AIM-9X had been selected specifically because its heat-seeking infrared guidance system gave a higher probability of a kill against a small, non-propelled object than a radar-guided missile would have. Octagonal, with strings, no propulsion, no payload, at 20,000 feet. That description did not match a conventional weather balloon, which is typically spherical. It did not match a known research platform. Military officials acknowledged at the time that they needed to get their hands on one to understand what they were dealing with, which, given that they had just destroyed it, was no longer possible. The video released on May 22nd is 46 seconds long. It was recorded by the F-16's Advanced Targeting Pod in infrared, black and white, the same sensor format used in the military UAP clips released 2 weeks earlier. Its official title reads USAFA NGF 16C call sign shoots down UAP over Lake Huron with weapon system, February 12, 2023. The call sign is redacted. The weapon system designation is redacted. At the 11-second mark, the sensor resolves an area of contrast in the center of its field of view. At the 20-second mark, there is a kinetic interaction. The target fragments in what the official description calls a radial displacement pattern, consistent with a high-energy event. In plain terms, an object appears, a missile hits it, and it comes apart. This is the first time in history that the U.S. government has released footage of itself shooting down an unidentified aerial object. The official assessment, delivered by former AARO Director Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, is that the three objects destroyed over Alaska, the Yukon, and Lake Huron between February 10th and 12th were almost certainly all balloons. That conclusion is based on three factors: radar signatures consistent with small, slow, unpropelled objects drifting with high-altitude wind currents, altitude profiles consistent with passive high-altitude drift, and the post-impact thermal signature visible in the declassified footage. That assessment may be correct, but it leaves a series of factual gaps that the footage alone cannot close. The pilots who intercepted the Lake Huron object described it as octagonal with strings, a shape inconsistent with a standard spherical weather balloon. NORAD tracked it with military-grade radar systems specifically designed to characterize aerial targets, and still could not produce a definitive identification before the engagement. After the missile struck and the debris fell into the lake, no recovered material was publicly confirmed. The search found nothing conclusive. The object that NORAD tracked, that an F-16 engaged, that cost the U.S. government nearly $800,000 in ordnance across 2 shots. It remains, in the official record, unidentified. At the post-engagement press conference in February 2023, a reporter asked NORAD Commander General Glenn Van Herk whether there might be more undetected objects flying over North American airspace. His answer: "It's certainly possible, but I cannot confirm that." He could not confirm it then. The Pursue release did not change that answer. What the release added was 46 seconds of infrared footage, a redacted call sign, a redacted weapon designation, and an official conclusion that stops just short of certainty. The Lake Huron object no longer exists as a physical artifact that can be examined, tested, or identified. Whatever material, structural, or technological information it contained is now distributed across the floor of a lake in 60 meters of cold, fresh water. The rest of the 2026 Pursue release deals in objects that remain unidentified but still exist somewhere, still flying, still traceable in principle. Lake Huron is different. The U.S. military destroyed the evidence before the question was answered. The 2026 UFO files did not give a simple answer. They never intended to. What the government released across 2 tranches was not a verdict. It was an archive, and archives do not explain themselves. They accumulate. They contradict. They contain things no one knew were there, sitting alongside things that were always there but never read. The 2026 release was exactly that, a record so wide and so deep that the more carefully you read it, the more questions it opened. Start with the military videos. The infrared sensor footage showed small targets over water, near clouds, alone and in groups, visible in some sensor modes and invisible in others. In Syria, a target left the frame the moment the sensor stopped tracking it. Not slowing, not descending, just gone. Near Iran, several small objects moved through the sensor view in formation. In the Greece case, a mission report described the target as diamond-shaped, traveling at approximately 434 knots, visible only through shortwave infrared before the sensor mode changed, and it vanished from the record entirely. These were not amateur videos. They were captured by military platforms with trained operators. The objects were real enough to track. They were not real enough to explain. The Western U.S. event added something the sensor footage alone could not: trained human witnesses. Across 2 days, 3 teams of federal law enforcement agents reported orange orbs releasing smaller red orbs in groups of 2 to 4, the sequence repeating at least 5 times. 2 agents later saw a large, fiery orange orb near a rock pinnacle, silent, apparently hovering, estimated by AARO at between 12 and 18 meters in diameter. In the pre-dawn hours, 2 agents pursued what appeared to be a vehicle in a restricted zone. 1 red light, 1 white light, 2 to 3 feet off the ground. It moved laterally, off the road, over open desert, at 15 to 20 miles per hour, stopped, and turned off its lights. Through night vision, it appeared as a thin line, a dark kite shape hovering just above the ground. A spotlight beam reportedly stopped projecting at about 50 yards, then resumed normally. The late 2025 senior intelligence official case went further still. A helicopter crew, radar contacts, ground teams, fighter jets, and more than an hour of orange orb activity above a military test range. Objects that split. Objects that approached within 10 feet of a rotor blade. Objects that tracked fighter jets at 23,000 feet, matched their speed and heading, then went dark. The officer who filed the report had spent a career in intelligence. When it was over, he reduced the entire encounter to a single line: "We were virtually speechless after these observations." The Sandia file took the record back to the atomic age. Between 1948 and 1950, 209 sightings of green orbs, fireballs, and disks near nuclear weapons facilities in New Mexico. After a green fireball near Socorro on July 24, 1949, investigators found copper-bearing particles in the air, some unusually large, along with cobalt-bearing spherical particles. The file does not prove the particles came from the fireball. It shows that someone was looking, and that what they found was not nothing. The pattern repeated at nuclear sites across decades: Pantex, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Sandia. The same locations where the most sensitive weapons work in American history was being conducted were also, consistently, the locations generating the most persistent and unresolved UAP reports. That is not a coincidence that the files explain. The NASA records extended the pattern into orbit. Gemini 7, Apollo 11, Apollo 12, Apollo 17, Skylab, Mercury. Astronauts on government missions, in government vehicles, filing government reports, describing lights, particles, flashes, unidentified objects, and in at least one case, a triangle of 3 dots in the lunar sky in a photograph now under active government investigation. With the original Apollo 17 film in federal custody and no public conclusion yet reached, the FBI archive showed how far the trail goes back. Kenneth Arnold's sighting in 1947. The Wiley teletype sent the same day as the Roswell headlines. A special agent's memo describing 3 craft and 3 crews recovered in New Mexico. Muroc Army Airfield witnesses. Oak Ridge radar and photographic cases. The Rhodes negatives that went into government hands and never came back. 21 years of flying disc material preserved inside a federal case file. And then there is the Lake Huron case, the one file in the entire release where the government did not just observe an unidentified object, track it, and file a report. It shot one down. On February 12, 2023, an F-16 fired 2 AIM-9X missiles over Lake Huron at an octagonal object with strings hanging below it, and no discernible propulsion or payload. The second missile connected. The object disintegrated. Search teams found nothing conclusive in the water. The footage sat on a classified network for 3 years until Congress formally requested it in writing. The official assessment says it was almost certainly a balloon. The pilots who intercepted it described a shape that does not match a standard balloon. The debris that could have settled the question is on the floor of a lake in 60 meters of cold, fresh water. Whatever answer it carried went down with it. And outside American borders, the record continued. High-speed overflights over Papua New Guinea that prompted a sitting prime minister to attend a public meeting. A Tajik air crew watching an object maneuver at 100,000 feet for 40 minutes over Kazakhstan, above the ceiling of anything that has ever flown on conventional propulsion. A CIA intelligence source stepping outside a Soviet weapons range on a clear night and watching a green light expand into concentric rings before disappearing without a sound. Since the portal launched on May 8, 2026, war.gov/UFO has received over 1 billion visits. 1 billion. That number is not a measure of curiosity. It is a measure of something that had been building for decades, a public that had been told for generations that there was nothing to see, and then was shown 1,000 pages of evidence that there was. A ARO has noted that the majority of UAP cases in the Pursue archive resolve to conventional explanations: drones, balloons, birds, weather phenomena, or sensor artifacts. That is an honest statement. Many of them do. But the word majority is doing significant work in that sentence. It is not all. It is not even close to all. Republican lawmakers who pushed hardest for this transparency, are already saying the government still isn't telling the whole story. That is notable, not because politicians are always right, but because these are the same people with enough clearance to know what has not been released. They are not satisfied with what has been shown. They say there is more, and there is more. Tranche 3 is expected in mid to late June 2026, and insiders say it will focus on USOs, unidentified submerged objects, underwater and transmedium, UAP encounters that Tranche 2 already began to introduce. Objects that do not just fly. Objects that enter the water. Objects that move between air and ocean without apparent deceleration. Reports of that category have existed inside military files for decades. They have never been addressed publicly. They are, apparently, next. The government has described Pursue as a rolling release, drawing from tens of millions of records, many existing only on paper, spanning many decades. Tens of millions. 2 tranches have produced a few hundred files. The arithmetic of what remains is not comforting. The strongest questions the 2,026 files leave behind are not about any single case. They are about the pattern. Why do the most persistent and unexplained UAP reports cluster around nuclear and strategic military sites across multiple decades and multiple countries? Why did trained pilots, federal agents, military crews, and astronauts, people whose careers depend on accurate observation and credible reporting, consistently describe objects that no official investigation has been able to explain? Why did photographs disappear into government custody? Why did a senior FBI agent, asked decades later about the most significant teletype of his career, say only that no one had burned his garage down? And why, after everything the 2,026 files revealed, does the government's own office say that a meaningful subset of cases still has no conventional explanation? The archive is not finished. It never was. It was always larger than what was being shown, larger than what most people were allowed to know existed. The files have started moving. The question now is how far they go.